Ladies and gentlemen, elections are integral to democratic governance. Through the mechanism of elections, politicians are held accountable for their actions and are compelled to introduce policies that are reflective of and responsive to public opinion. Ideally, elections serve as a major source of political recruitment, a means of making government and of transferring government power, a guarantee of representation, and a major determinant of government policy. These do not, however, prevent the distortion of the will of the electorate in a flawed democracy. Legitimacy by referendum. Despite protests and controversies, barangay citizen assemblies were convened and ratified the 1973 Constitution. Article 17, or the transitory provisions of the Marcos Constitution, provided for the replacement of the Philippine Congress with an interim National Assembly. Rule by referendum. A major feature of the martial law period was the holding of referendums for purposes of popular decision-making. On July 20, 1973, fresh from a popular controlled mandate, Marcos held another referendum intended to respond to the issue of his term extension. The question in the referendum was whether or not the people wanted Marcos to continue serving as president beyond 1973 and quote-unquote finish the reforms he has initiated under martial law. The obvious results of the referendum showed that 90% of the voters wanted Marcos to extend his term as president beyond what was provided for in the Constitution and effectively putting an end to presidential term limits. In addition, the referendum results indicated support for a plan by Marcos to postpone the holding of elections for members of the National Assembly as provided for in the 1973 Constitution. Not surprisingly, this referendum in February 1975 also reported overwhelming support for the president to continue serving as chief executive under martial rule and the 1973 Constitution. The intention to hold the third referendum was more to provide legitimacy in the eyes of the regime's international financial supporters and lenders. In addition, the referendum that year gave the president additional powers to appoint and replace local government officials whose elective terms had expired in December of 1973.
Elections under martial rule and the strengthening advantage of the incumbent. Marcos explained that martial law was not a military takeover but the only option to resolve the country's dilemma over rebellion that led to chaos and an imminent threat to the peace and order of the country. And according to Marcos' plan, this rule was to lead the country into what he calls a new society. Now, during its election, Marcos and his administration had mocked the concept of election more than any government since Quirino in 1949. Official campaign periods were subverted and reduced from its original form of days, from 120 days to 45 days, which provokes the competitor candidates an advantage of the incumbent. These changes of election believed to hinder the opposition to run and win. Now, aside from this, Commission on Election or the COMELEC have constrained to facilitate and manipulate the result. This emergency rule was also intended to eradicate the roots of rebellion, but however, because of Marcos' action, this was the start of his fall.
Reemergence of party politics. The first elections for the members of the Interim National Pambansa was held on April 7, 1978. Just before the elections, there was a political party established to support Marcos' ideology, which is the New Society Movement or the Kilusang Bagong Lipunan or KBL for short. This KBL was led by none other than the First Lady herself, Miss Imelda Marcos. There are many opposing political groups and one of these is the Liberal Party, which called for a boycott of the elections. Some of them organized under a new opposing political group which is the People's Power or Lakas ng Bayan or Laban Party. The Laban was led by Benigno Aquino Jr. Despite the efforts of Laban, KBL won the majority. They occupied 186 seats out of 207. Hatchcroft and Racoroma observed that KBL was not created in the same mold as the traditional pre-martial law party politics because KBL achieved a centralized control of government resources. For this reason, local officials especially became very eager to join the ruling party. This invariably tilted the balance of power in favor of the national over the local. To an unprecedented degree in history, the Marcos family dominated much of any single clan and this included the ruling party itself.
The elite pre-martial law and the anti-Marcos opposition established a UNIDO, or United Nationalist Democratic Opposition. The UNIDO targets urban-based middle-class and Christian segment of population calling for a so-called return to real democracy. UNIDO was led by the Liberal Party leaders, namely Manuel Rojas, Jovito Salonga, and Benigno Aquino. The objective of the group is to oust President Marcos through a legal political process and to unify people to support for a single candidate, which was at that time, Benigno was their candidate for the presidential election. Talking about an extra-legal opposition launching of urban insurrection in Manila by two movements, namely a Light on the Fire movement and an April 6 Liberation movement, both in 1979. The objective of two movements are to break government stability, and the strategy of it is in form of violence, specifically in bombing. So that's why Marcos uplift the martial law. Moving to the first martial rule, the new referendum was born, and it is to restrain the possibility of the opposition to participate in presidential electoral. It is requiring the presidential candidate to be at least 55 years old. It is obviously targeting Benigno Aquino to restrain from running for the opposition because Benigno Aquino at the time is not yet 55 years old. Because of the new referendum, it gave to the opposition a low percentage of hope winning for the presidential election. So that's why the People's Opposition to Plebiscite an Election was established. And the objective of the group is to boycott any plebiscite and election called by the administration, which is very effective because in the first presidential election in June 1981, Marcos has to put up his own opponent, namely the non-political entity, Alejo Santos. And in June 16, 1981, Marcos won in 88% of the votes and was proclaimed the president for the 6-year term, under the semi-parliamentary form of government.
August 21, 1983, Benigno Aquino Jr. was assassinated, and Ferdinand Marcos, the president that time, was known as the primary suspect of that incident. Ferdinand Marcos' regime was full of dictatorship, monopolizing of election, media, and as well as the military since 1972. In both May 14, 1984 election of the regular assembly and February 7, 1986 election, or shall we say presidential election, all alliance of opposition were created to fight against Ferdinand Marcos. But no matter how effort and determined they're still defeated until such time President Marcos and Cory Aquino are battling for presidency. Marcos again did everything to manipulate election, and he did win that time. But because Cory Aquino garnered support from millions of Filipinos, she did her oath-taking separate from the Malacanang Palace, because according to them, Cory Aquino won the election. But because people are tired of Marcos' dictatorship, people engaged to a wide revolution. Their anger and strength reaches towards inside the Malacanang Palace and made Marcos flew from Malacanang to Hawaii, and finally Marcos died there and ended his presidency and dictatorship.